Introduction to the locations of culture. A quotation, a remark is taken from Martin Heidegger's building dwelling thinking. Remark was a boundary is not that at which something stops, but as the Greeks recognized, the boundary is that from which something begins its presence. First is border lives, the art of the present. It is the trophy of our times to locate the question of culture is the realm of the beyond. At the century age, we are less exercised by annihilation. The death of the author or epiphany, the birth of the subject. Our existence today is marked by a tenebrous sense of survival, living on the borderlines of the present for which there seems to be no proper name other than the current and controversial acceptance of the prefix post. Postmodernism, postcolonialism, postfeminism. The beyond is neither a new horizon nor a leaving behind of the past. Beginnings and ending may be the sustaining myths of the Middle Years, but in the Findasikil, we find ourselves in the moment of transit where space and time cross to produce complex figures of difference and identity, past and present, inside and outside, inclusion and exclusion, for where this is a sense of disorientation, a disturbance of direction in the beyond, an exploratory restless movement caught so well in the French rendition of the words a de la. Here and there on all sides, Fort da, hither and thither, back and forth. The move away from singularities of class or gender as primary conceptual and organizational categories has resulted in an awareness of the subject position of race, gender, generation, institutional location, geopolitical local, sexual orientation that inhabit any claim to the identity in the modern world. What is theoretically innovative and politically crucial is the need to think beyond narrative of originary and initial subjectivities and so focus on those moments or processes that are produced in the articulation of cultural differences. These in between spaces provide the terrain for elaborating strategies of selfhood, singular or communal, that initiate new signs of identity and innovative sites of collaboration and contestation in the act of defining the idea of society itself. It is in the emergence of the interstices that overlap and displacement of domains of difference that the intersubjective and collective experiences of nationalness, community interest, or cultural values are negotiated. How are subjects formed in between or in excess of the sum of the parts of difference, usually intoned as race, class, gender, etc. How do strategies of representation or empowerment come to be formulated in the competing claims of communities where, despite shared histories of deprivation and discrimination, the exchange of values, meanings, and priorities may not always be collaborative and dialogical but may be profoundly antagonistic, conflictual, and even incommensurable. The force of this question is borne out by the language of recent social crises, sparked off by histories of cultural differences, conflicts in South Central Los Angeles between Koreans, Mexican Americans, and African Americans. Focus on the concept of disrespect, a term forged on the borderlines of ethnic deprivation, and that is at once the sign of racialized violence and the symptom of social victimage in the aftermath of the satanic versus affair in Great Britain. Black and Irish feminists, despite their different constituencies, have made common cause against the racialization of religion as the dominant discourse through which the state represents their conflict and struggle, however secular or even sexual they may be. Terms of cultural engagement, whether antagonistic or affiliative, are produced performatively. The representation of difference must not be hastily read as the reflection of pre-given ethnic or cultural traits set in the fixed tablet of tradition. The social articulation of difference from the minority perspective is a complex ongoing negotiation that seeks to authorize cultural hybridities that emerged in moments of historical transformation. The right to signify from the periphery of authorized power and privilege does not depend on the persistence of tradition. It is resourced by the power of tradition to be reinscribed through the conditions of contingency and contradictoriness that attend upon the lives of those who are in the minority. The recognition that tradition bestows in a partial form of identification in restaging the past, it introduces other incommensurable cultural temporalities into the invention of tradition. This process estranges any immediate access to an originary identity or a received tradition. The borderline engagements of cultural differences may as often be consensual as conflictual. They may confound our definitions of tradition and modernity, religion, the customary boundaries between the private and the public, high and low, and challenge normative expectation of development and progress. I wanted to make shapes or set up situations that are kind of open. My work has a lot to do with a kind of fluidity, a movement back and forth, not making a claim to any specific or essential way of being. Thus, writes Rennie Green, the African American artist, she reflects on the need to understand cultural differences as the production of minority identity that is split or estranged into themselves in the act of being articulated into a collective body. It was said multiculturalism doesn't reflect the complexity of the situation as I face it daily. It requires a person to step outside of him herself to actually see what he sees doing. I don't want to condemn well meaning people and say like those are t-shirts you can buy on the street, it's black thing you wouldn't understand. To me that is essentializing blackness. Political empowerment and the enlargement of the multiculturalist cause come from posing questions of solidarity and community from the interstitial perspective. Social differences are not simply given to experience through an already authenticated cultural tradition, they are the signs of emergence of community envisaged as a project at once a vision and a construction that takes you beyond yourself in order to return in a spirit of revision and reconstruction to the political condition of the present. Even then, it is still a struggle for power between various groups within ethnic groups about what is being said and who is saying what, who is representing who, what is community anyway, what is a black community, what is a Latino community. I have trouble with thinking of all these things as monolithic fixed categories. If Rainy Green's questions open up an interrogatory interstitial space between the act of representation who, what, where, and the presence of community itself, then consider her own creative intervention within this in between movement. Green's architectural site specific work sites of genealogy out of sight. The institution of contemporary art Long Island City, New York displays and displaces the binary logic through which identities of differences are often constructed black, white, self other. Green makes a metaphor of the museum building itself rather than simply using the gallery space. I used architectural initially as a reference using the attic, the holier, the boiler room, and the stairwell to make associations between certain binary divisions such as higher and lower and heaven and hell. The stairwell became a liminal space, a pathway between the upper and lower areas, each of which was annotated with blacks, referring to blackness and whiteness. This stairwell as liminal space in between the designation of identity becomes the process of symbolic interaction, the connective tissues and constructs the difference between upper and lower, black and white, the higher and the dither of the stairwell. The temporal movement and passage what is that is allows prevents identity at either end of it from setting into primordial polarities. The interstitial passage between fixed identifications opens up the possibility of a culture hybridity that entertains difference without an assumed or imposed hierarchy. I always went back and forth between racial designation and designations from physics or other symbolic designation. All these things blur in some way to develop genealogy of the way colors and non-colors function is interesting to me. Beyond signifies spatial distance marks progress promises the future, but our intimation of exceeding the barrier or boundaries, the very act of going beyond, are unknowable, unrepresentable without a return to the present, which in the process of repetition becomes disjunct and displaced the imaginary of a spatial distance to live somehow beyond the border of our times throw into relief the temporal social differences that interrupt our cohesive sense of cultural contemporaneity. The present can no longer be simply envisaged as a break or a bonding with the past and the future. No longer our synchronic presence, our proximate self presence, our public image comes to be rebelled for its discontinuity, its inequalities, its minorities, unlike the dead hand of history that tells the beards of sequential time like a rosary seeking to establish serial causal connections. We are now confronted with what Walter Benjamin described as the blasting of monadic movement from the homogeneous course of history, establishing a conception of the present as the time of the now.